The wind clawed at her, a furious, unseen beast tearing the last heat from her thin cloak. Snow, fine as dust then heavy as stones, plastered itself to her face, stinging her exposed skin. Sarah huddled deeper into the shallow hollow beside the ice-scoured rock, breath coming in ragged gasps that fogged the air and offered no warmth. They had left her here, just here, on the edge of nothing. The wagon tracks were already gone, swallowed by the relentless white. Panic, a cold, sharp thing, pierced through the numbness in her limbs. She had nowhere to go, knew nothing of this brutal land. Her world, a fragile porcelain thing built on promises and soft words, had shattered. Now there was only the wind, the snow, and the gnawing, terrifying silence of abandonment. Tears froze on her cheeks. She was young, sheltered, utterly unprepared for the sheer, indifferent cruelty of the wild. All her life had been lived within fences, within expectations. Now the only boundary was the horizon, vast and deadly. Hours bled into a formless agony of cold and fear. Her thoughts became sluggish, dreams of warmth and food flickering at the edges of her awareness like cruel mirages. She was dying, she knew. A quiet, lonely end in the snow. Then, through the blurring curtain of white, she saw it. A faint, flickering pinprick of light, impossibly far. It seemed a trick of the light, a desperate hallucination. But it persisted, a steady pulse in the storm's heart. Could it be? Hope, a frail bird, fluttered weakly in her chest, gathering a strength she didn't know she possessed. Fueled by the primal will to survive, she pushed herself onto trembling legs. Every movement was an act of pain. She stumbled, fell, pushed herself up again, fixing her gaze on that distant spark. The wind tried to push her back, the snow sought to bury her, but the light drew her forward, a fragile tether to existence. The light grew, resolving into the outline of a small, squat cabin, smoke pluming from a stone chimney. She reached it not with a rush of relief, but with a final, ragged gasp, collapsing against the rough-hewn logs. Her fingers scrabbled weakly at the door. It opened, casting a rectangle of dim, smoky warmth onto the snow. A figure stood silhouetted against the firelight, a man, large and still. He said nothing, his face obscured by shadow. Sarah could only croak out a desperate, wordless plea, collapsing entirely across the threshold. She felt strong hands lift her, not gently, but with a rough practicality, pulling her inside, out of the storm. The warmth hit her like a physical blow, painful in its intensity. She was laid near the fire, a scratchy blanket draped over her. She looked up at the man, his face now visible in the firelight. It was weathered, lined, unreadable. His eyes, dark and deep-set, regarded her with an expression she couldn't decipher. Not pity, not anger, perhaps just weary surprise. He was an island of quiet stillness in the storm's roar outside, a silent, solitary presence who had opened his door to a stranger. Her last conscious thought was a confusing mix of terror and an overwhelming, fragile gratitude for this unexpected, unasked-for rescue. The warmth seeped into her bones, and she fell into a deep, exhausted sleep, the wind still howling its rage outside. Sarah awoke to the smell of wood smoke and something cooking thin, watery broth perhaps, but food nonetheless. The cabin was small, sparsely furnished. A rough table, 2 chairs, a narrow cot she now occupied, and a stone fireplace that dominated one wall. The man sat by the fire, mending a piece of leather tack with slow, deliberate movements. He didn't look at her immediately. She watched him, wary. He was lean, with strong hands and a quiet competence about him. His clothes were worn but clean. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackling fire and the persistent moan of the wind outside. It was less a comfortable quiet and more a deliberate absence of noise. She felt acutely aware of her presence, an intrusion in this solitary space. Finally, he finished his task, set the tack aside, and turned to face her. His gaze was steady, assessing, making her feel transparent. "You'll freeze out there," he said. his voice low and gravelly, like stones shifting. It was the first sound she'd heard him make. She nodded, unable to find her voice. Her throat felt raw. "Who left you?" he asked, his eyes holding hers. The question was simple, direct, but it felt like a punch. Tears welled despite herself. My family," she whispered, the word tasting like ash. They were going on. Said I was too much trouble." It sounded pathetic, even to her own ears. He didn't offer sympathy, didn't ask why she was trouble. He simply nodded slowly, a flicker of something. Understanding? Resignation? Crossing his features. "This ain't a place for trouble," he stated, his gaze drifting towards the window where snow still pressed against the pane. "Or for folks who can't make their own way." His bluntness stung, yet it felt honest in a way the soft lies she'd been told never had. She looked down at her hands, still stiff and sore. I don't know how," she admitted, the vulnerability heavy in the air. He stood then, walked to the fireplace, and stirred the contents of a pot hanging over the flames. "Learn," he said simply, without turning, "or you don't last." He ladled some of the thin broth into a metal cup and brought it to her. He didn't offer to help her drink. It was another small test, she sensed. She took the cup with trembling hands, the warmth a blessed relief against her frozen fingers. She sipped it slowly, finding a meager strength returning. He watched her for a moment longer, then returned to his chair by the fire, picking up another piece of leather. The silence resumed. She finished the broth, feeling a fragile thread of life strengthening within her. She was beholden to this man, this stranger who had spent what little fuel he had on her, who was sharing his meager provisions. He hadn't asked her name. She hadn't asked his. They were simply two souls stranded by the storm, one a rescuer, the other rescued, bound by the harsh circumstance. She didn't know how long he would tolerate her presence, or what he expected. But for now, she was warm, she was alive, and that felt like a miracle. She watched him work, his face impassive, a silent guardian in the small circle of firelight. Days blurred into a quiet, difficult rhythm. The storm eventually subsided, but the cold remained a constant, biting presence. Sarah stayed. The man, Elias, as she eventually learned from a single, gruff response to her timid question, didn't tell her to leave. Nor did he make any show of welcome. He simply existed alongside her, a silent, watchful entity. He spent his days tending to the few head of cattle he owned, chopping wood, mending fences swallowed by snow. Sarah, initially hesitant and clumsy, began to try and help. She fetched wood, awkward with the heavy logs. She learned to keep the fire going, a vital, consuming task. She washed the few dishes they used in melted snow. Elias offered no praise, no instruction beyond a rare, terse correction. But he also offered no criticism. His acceptance of her help, however small and fumbling, felt like a profound concession. She watched him, how he moved with the land, understanding its moods and demands. How he handled his animals with a quiet authority that wasn't unkindness. How his eyes, sharp and observant, missed nothing. She began to see past the stoicism to the deep lines of fatigue around his eyes, the worn calluses on his hands, the threadbare patches on his coat. His last penny wasn't a coin. It was the fuel he burned to keep her warm, the flour he shared for their meager biscuits, the portion of his own dwindling supplies he didn't begrudge her, though he barely had enough for himself. He was giving her life with the very substance of his own survival. And in return, she offered the only thing she had, her willing, if unskilled, hands and her quiet presence. The fear that had gripped her initially began to recede, replaced by a determined resolve. She would not be a burden. She would learn. One evening, huddled by the fire, the wind rattling the cabin walls, she finally found the courage to speak of what had happened. She didn't use the word virgin, but spoke of her upbringing, her innocence, the naive trust she had placed in promises of a different life out west, and the stark, brutal reality of being left behind when she proved to be an inconvenience. She spoke of the shame, the crushing feeling of being unwanted and disposable. Elias listened, still, his gaze fixed on the flames. When she finished, the silence returned, thick with unspoken things. She braced herself for judgment, for the confirmation that she was indeed trouble, but he said only, "Lots of folks get left behind in one way or another out here. Land's hard. Breaks people." It wasn't an absolution, but it was an acknowledgement. It placed her experience within the context of this unforgiving world, not as a personal failing, but as another casualty of its harshness. It felt unexpectedly like the beginning of acceptance, and not just from him but perhaps, finally, of her own story. She was no longer just the girl who was abandoned. She was someone who had survived the snow, and was now learning to survive the land itself, alongside this quiet, resilient man. A week later, the fragile peace was shattered. It wasn't the weather this time, but the sound of horses and rough voices. Rustlers. Elias moved with swift, silent efficiency. He banked the fire, plunging the cabin into near darkness. He grabbed his rifle, checked the action with a quiet click. "Stay low. Don't make a sound," he ordered, his voice taut. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, the old fear returning, sharp and cold. But it was different this time. It wasn't just fear for herself, but a fierce, protective surge for this quiet man who had saved her, for this small, hard-won haven. She gripped a heavy iron poker, her knuckles white. The men outside were loud, arrogant, their intent clear. They were after Elias's few cattle, perhaps more. "Elias, we know you're in there. Send him out or we'll burn you out," a voice bellowed. Elias didn't reply. He moved to a crack in the wall, peered out. Sarah watched him, her breath held tight. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the grim set of his jaw. He wasn't going to give up without a fight. The cabin door suddenly rattled violently under a heavy kick. Splinters flew. Last chance. Elias raised his rifle. "Get back," he warned, his voice clear and steady despite the danger. A shot rang out, tearing through the wooden wall near Elias's head. He flinched but held his ground. He fired back. The roar of the rifle was deafening in the small space. A grunt of pain from outside. Another shot from the rustlers, hitting the door. Panic threatened to overwhelm Sarah, but she looked at Elias, saw his steady hands, his focused gaze, and swallowed her fear. He wasn't just surviving, he was fighting. And she was part of this place now, part of this fight. When the rustlers tried to pry open a window, she moved, swift and silent as Elias himself had taught her to be in small ways. She grabbed a bucket of icy water they used for washing and flung it through the gap, aiming for the hands and faces scrabbling at the frame. A shout of surprise and pain. It was a small thing, foolish perhaps, but it was action. It was fighting back. Elias glanced at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Not annoyance, perhaps a grudging respect. The rustlers, surprised by the resistance and perhaps not wanting a prolonged shootout in the cold, eventually retreated, shouting threats into the night. The sound of their horses faded into the wind. Silence returned, but it was different now, charged with adrenaline and the smell of gunpowder. Elias lowered his rifle slowly, his shoulders slumping slightly with tension released. He looked at the hole in the wall, the damaged door. He turned to Sarah, who still gripped the poker, trembling. For the first time, he didn't just look at her. He seemed to see her. See the wide, scared eyes, the tight grip on the iron, the small act of defiance with the water. "Didn't freeze up," he observed, his voice still rough, but lacking its usual edge. "No," she managed, her voice trembling. "They weren't taking your place." He looked away then, back at the damaged door. But the shared moment lingered. They had faced a threat together, an external force that had solidified the fragile bond between them. She hadn't been a passive victim. She had acted. He hadn't abandoned her to face it alone. He had protected his home, and she was in it. The air in the small cabin felt warmer, not just from the fire, but from something else, something quiet and resilient forged in the crucible of shared danger. The virgin lost in the snow was gone. replaced by a woman with calloused hands and eyes that had seen danger and hadn't entirely flinched. The days that followed the attack were filled with the practical tasks of mending and preparing for the inevitable return of true winter. They worked side by side, the rhythm of their labor replacing the need for conversation. Elias repaired the wall and the door, Sarah helping him hold planks, learning how to hammer a nail straight. She learned to chop wood more efficiently, finding a satisfying release in the swing of the axe. She learned to cook their simple meals without setting anything on fire. She was no longer the helpless girl who had collapsed on his doorstep. She was becoming a part of this life, a small, necessary component in the harsh equation of survival. Elias spoke little as always, but his silence felt less like distance and more like companionable quiet. He would watch her sometimes, a long, steady look that made her feel seen in a way she never had before. There was no sentimentality, no grand gestures. Their connection was built on shared hardship, mutual reliance, and a quiet, unspoken respect forged in the snow and tested by fire. The last penny he had given her was not just survival. It was the chance to build herself anew, away from the judgment and abandonment, in a place where worth was measured not by status or expectation, but by resilience and the willingness to face the storm. One evening, as the first truly deep frost settled outside, Elias stoked the fire, filling the cabin with warmth. He looked at Sarah, then towards the window where the stars were beginning to pierce the inky blackness. "Winter's here," he stated, a simple fact. "Yes," she replied, feeling a surprising sense of readiness rather than dread. He paused, then added, his voice low, "You'll make it." It was more than just words. It was an affirmation. He saw her strength, acknowledged her transformation. The girl abandoned in the snow was gone. In her place was a woman standing on her own 2 feet, capable, determined. She had found not just warmth, but a flicker of self-worth in this unforgiving land, guided by the silent strength of the man who had risked his meager life for hers. The future stretched ahead, still uncertain, still harsh, but no longer faced alone. Resilience wasn't about avoiding the storm, she had learned. It was about finding shelter in it, and sometimes, finding an unexpected hand reaching out from the darkness.